Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Strategy Gap. We're actually going to do things a little bit differently this episode. So instead of having a guest interview that we've been doing for the past couple of months, we thought it was a great time of year to talk about a particular topic that I'm sure is on everyone's minds, which is annual planning. So we're going to do a roundtable discussion with myself and Joe, but we also have a new colleague from Achieve It joining us for the very first time on The Strategy Gap, Lindsay LeFaivre, who is our Director of Customer Engagement. Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here with the two of you. We've been working together for a long time, so excited to put all this knowledge out to the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we kick off into questions, since we're doing a new format this time, we thought it might be helpful for our listeners that maybe don't know each of us as directly to get a little bit of background on what we've done in the strategy world and kind of how that lends itself to this conversation. So Lindsay, why don't you kick us off with a little bit of background on you?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do it. So, Lindsay LeFaivre, as Jonathan mentioned, I am Director of Customer Success here at Achieve It. And I've been at Achieve It now for over 5 years. So, the entire time that I've been here, I've been working with Joe and Jonathan as well. And my main capacity has been within customer success. So, a lot of what I am seeing is those folks that are trying to now execute on the strategic plan and really seeing what are those trials and tribulations that they come across and how can I help them really get over that hump that they potentially have. Prior to my time at Achieve It, I worked for a startup in Phoenix, Arizona, and was basically a customer success department of one. I did that for a little over 3 years before coming over to the team, and spent most of my time really working with a lot of folks in smaller businesses, a lot of entrepreneurs who are able to see all the different hats that folks wear here. But just like Joe and Jonathan, I spent a lot of time thinking about strategy, learning about strategy, also diving into project management as well, having gone through my Google project management cert just last year. So quite a bit that I've seen throughout my time here today. But of course, there's a lot that the rest of the crew has seen too. And so, Joe, I would love it if you would also share a little bit about your background and how we have worked together for, over 5 years now.
Exactly. It's pretty hard. It's pretty crazy to hear 5 years. It seems like it was just yesterday, but it's been an interesting 5 years for sure. But thank you for that, Lindsay. And for those that may know me or maybe not, I've been here for 10 years. I've been here since Achieve It opened its doors, since it became Achieve It. And I've always had a customer facing role in that capacity. So I've been doing strategy execution work for the better part of 10 years. I've supplemented that previously coming to Achieve It. I had a master's degree completed from Boston University in a discipline called healthcare communications. For those that are unaware what that is, a lot of strategic planning, a lot of health literacy, public health advocacy, epidemiology, you name it. I started my career in the pharmaceutical space. So it just helps me hopefully condense very abstract concepts, very dense topics, and make them more relatable and practical. And so that really served me very well at Achieve It for the last 10 years. And then about 7 years in, I decided, why not get an MBA? So any extra money I had, I said, let's just give it to Rutgers, Boston University. I'm going to make sure that all my money was given away. So at this point, so basically my academic and professional career has been centered on this very topic. So it's exciting to have a true roundtable with folks that have a ton of experience as well. And that leads us to Mr. Morgan, who's our host, but also it's time for him to talk about how he got here as well, because his background is extensive.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Joe. So currently at Achieve It, leading revenue operations and aspects of strategy for our go-to-market teams. I've been doing that for the past 4, I guess almost 5 years. But prior to that, I had the lovely pleasure of working closely with Joe and Lindsay as a strategy consultant, guiding our customers from that journey through strategic planning towards execution. And as we know, all the things that can go wrong in between. Prior to Achieve It, did time may not be the best way to say it, but did some stints at small and large companies, leading various aspects of go-to-market strategy, project management, consulting, and a little bit of everything in between. So happy to kick off the conversation today. I don't know about y'all, but certainly when I look out my window here, there's leaves falling to the ground, which if that means anything for people in strategy, it's normally the time of year when planning is abundant and there's a million meetings to think about what are all the things that we're going to do in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever period that they're thinking about. So really, that's why we wanted to start this episode and have a special episode about annual planning, because it's certainly something that everybody's going through and going to be top of mind for each organization, for the most part, on a calendar year format. So we'll go through, ask questions, talk about it, and we'll kind of roll through the questions as we need to. So I think one thing that people think about as they begin their planning process is, I have a million things that I need to get done, but where am I going to start? So the question I'm going to pose to the group is, when you think about planning or when you work with organizations thinking about planning, what is the very first thing you think they should do?
Set aside time for it. I actually put it on their calendars. I've had so many folks that I've talked to recently where they say, "Oh, we know that our fiscal year is ending in 2 months, but we just don't know when we're going to get started on planning for our next year. So maybe we'll do that in February." And I'm thinking, February, you're already going to be 2 months into your new fiscal year. So let's say it takes 2 months for you to plan. You're not going to actually be executing on it until you're 4 months into your fiscal year. So put it on the calendar and put it far in advance on your calendar, so you actually have time to sit down and do it. That's the number one thing I see people not doing right now.
I would agree 100% on that. And also setting a timeline for when planning is going to end. Some people start their planning process and it just goes in perpetuity because they'll have an hour-long meeting, or they'll say, yeah, let's, instead of having one full day, why don't we just do a couple 1-hour meetings and see how it goes? From experience, we've seen, especially during COVID, we help with a lot of planning services. What would usually take place in a normal 6-hour on-site meeting with lunch and all that ended up being typically 8 to 12 individual meetings that ended up having to be on the call to be set aside. And so cannot stress the importance of getting in a room, setting aside the time, like Lindsay mentioned, getting in a room, but also saying we got to be done with this by a certain date and hold yourself to it. It can't just keep going in the hopes of getting the perfect plan or getting the most insights. Do your best to get everybody involved, but you got to stop at a certain point so then you can focus on execution, like Lindsay mentioned.
Yeah, great answers. And I'm actually going to take it a little bit different direction. I didn't even think about those, which is shame on me. But I think most people often think about their plan as what are all the things that we're going to be doing, and forget what have we done and how did those things go. So I think an important step to kick off planning is to make sure you're doing a thorough recap of previous planning cycles, previous results, understanding what went well, what didn't go so well, what results we hit, what we didn't hit, and ultimately why those gaps were there between planning and execution, because that can begin to identify not just what are the things we're going to do, but what are the process changes that we have to make in order to make this year successful.
And that process, that retrospective, can be done a lot more efficiently if you spend the time putting KPIs into your plan. We spend a lot of time with clients talking about the importance of measurement, because if you're trying to do a retrospective and you don't have measurements, then it's going to start to sound more emotional. Yeah, I think we had a good year. I think we got a lot done, versus the idea of, oh, actually, we had a good year and let me prove it to you. And so the goal here is that you're making the end of the year and retrospective look more like a math problem. These are the 4 metrics that were really causing issues for us and for our customers. We were able to fix them with these initiatives. Therefore, we had a good year. Versus, look at all these projects we got done, but these 4 KPIs are still in a really bad spot. So that concept is difficult for folks. So the idea of just picking a couple measurements, at least something. There's something always you can measure, and then that will help you with what Jonathan just mentioned. And Lindsay, I know you've experienced plenty of times with it's difficult to get folks to commit to a metric. They'll say we can't do we don't have a baseline, we don't have a target. What have you seen helping folks like just finally create metrics that they're tracking to make their planning efforts better?
It's like you read my mind, Joe. I was going to talk about this, and a customer that you and I are working with currently, where they keep telling us, oh, well, we don't know what this is yet. We have to figure out a baseline. We know that we have to do a certain number of things, but we don't know what we're doing right now. We have to figure that out. And the problem is they want to keep doing that every year. They want to establish that baseline every year, and they don't have a shutoff point for themselves and saying, okay, fiscal year 24 is our year to do the baseline, but after 24, we're going to do that retrospective that Jonathan is talking about and see what was our baseline, and we're going to use that for the next year. The problem is they're just continually saying, we have to figure that out. You got 1 year to figure it out, and then we need to go off of that baseline number is one of the biggest things I see. So I know Joe knows exactly who I'm talking about with this, where they keep saying, oh, I don't know what it is. We have to figure it out. It's like, okay, do that for 1 year, but after that 1 year, no more of we have to figure it out. You have it figured out. Go based off those numbers that you see.
And that's Lindsay and I being nice, by the way. I mean, ultimately, you could have some sort of target to shoot for. You don't. When you're looking for a baseline, what that essentially means is that you're looking to see what the appropriate target is. If we want to have X amount of applicants from this sort of demographic, we need to then potentially get to a certain target. There are ways that you can just look at a benchmark for somebody in your industry and say, we need to be above at least 60% in this measurement in order to be deemed good. And then as you're developing the baseline, then you can set targets. So you don't completely have to disregard the whole baseline setting, but a lot of folks feel comfortable spending that time getting the baseline before they sign their signature on a target. But for those that maybe are a little bit more, I want to get going with this, you don't always have to go from baseline to target. You can just say, we need to be above this benchmark that is universally known as a good gold standard. As long as we're somewhere in that range, we're good while we develop a baseline. So it's a little bit of a hybrid approach. So you can go either way.
Yeah, we've navigated into an interesting topic that I think a lot of people struggle with, particularly in the planning cycle, and then therefore that impacts execution. So I'd be interested in getting y'all's thoughts on kind of general issues and problems, or how we set effective metrics and KPIs. But before I get y'all's thoughts on it, I'll tell you a little bit where I'm coming from. My experience with most organizations is they struggle with this problem because they either have no metrics whatsoever, or they have 1,000 metrics, and they're super tactical metrics. And when you're trying to uncover how is our plan being successful, you either say, I feel like it's doing pretty good, or you say, hey, look at all these million metrics that we accomplished, as opposed to taking the approach of leading and lagging indicators, where the leading are more activity based and the lagging are the more outcome based at the top of your plan. What else have y'all seen with planning when it comes to KPIs and metrics?
The idea of too many is interesting because you don't see that too often. People think they have too many when they have like a business intelligence platform, and they'll have all this data feeding in. A good example would be any hospital in your neighborhood. I went to one out in Oregon a number of years back, and it was a beautiful lobby, and on the wall they had these humongous TV screens, and they had a scroll of all the different metrics and how they compare against their competitors. So wait time, sepsis, infection rate, all the stuff that you probably would care about was there. They probably had a little bit, maybe 20% too many metrics, but in general, it was in context. And it also took the extra step of saying, here's where our number is, here's where our competitors are. And not every single time were they better than their competitors. That was an interesting and refreshing remark. It wasn't a cherry picked numbers. For the most part, they're a very good health system. So the majority of their numbers were the best, but they'll say, here's our cards, here they're on the table. And it was easily accessible in the most public setting. So that was an interesting thing where they said, let's pull the Band-Aid off and let's just actually track on it. The part that was missing, if I saw that the sepsis rate and infection rate was too high, there really wasn't a good connection between that and what they're doing to do what countermeasures they're taking. So we talk about that a lot, the qualitative and the quantitative. They got the quantitative handled, but then they were skimping on the qualitative. And so as a result, you need to have both. And I'm sure, Lindsay, you've seen that quite a bit, where without both, it starts to create a little bit of a muddy waters.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think to your point, Joe, there's not a lot of folks that have too many KPIs that I've run across recently. Most of them, they don't have enough that they're trying to track, and they can't figure out what are those key things that they need to do. And sometimes it's the person who is creating the plan. They feel like they don't have the ability to choose. This is what our most important KPIs are. They feel like it needs to come from somebody else, and they need to have a way of saying, this is what I've examined the landscape. This is what we need to focus on. And they need to feel confident saying, this is what I think we should focus on, because they're thinking this has to come from the CEO. It has to come from the board of directors, and they aren't giving that recommendation. And that's a piece that I see missing a lot of times. A lot of folks, they know the answer to the question. They want validation, and yes, this is what they should be doing. So they need to say, hey, this is what I would like us to do, and here's the reason why. And they need to present that to the board or the CEO, whoever it is that's going to give the final say on those KPIs.
Yeah, I think throughout this conversation, there's been a lot of mentions around all the different people involved in these metrics and kind of who needs to provide their input, which leads to, I think, another issue that many people face is when you're planning, you certainly need to have involvement across the organization, but you can't necessarily always listen to everybody in the organization and implement everything they want to do, or else you'd have an endless plan that you'd never actually be able to accomplish. So based on in y'all's collective experience, plans that you've seen be successful, who should be involved in that planning process, and maybe at what stage of that process?
Yeah, it's the age-old question we get every day. Should we do top down or bottom up, right? That's what everyone loves to say. But there's a third option, which is a little bit of both. And I know it seems like a cop-out answer when somebody says it depends, or you should do a little bit of both. But honestly, there is a lot of wisdom in the idea of moderation in all aspects of life, quite honestly, but also in planning. So when I say a hybrid, what that looks like is that the top-down folks, we call them the architects, right? The people that there's a subset of people that have disciplinary knowledge or subject matter experts in their respective departments. Those people need to get in a room and really distill down the world of what could be done and distill it down to an actual bite-sized, 4 to 6 items. And that isn't some easy thing to do. If you somehow had 50 people in that meeting, there is no way you're drilling down 100 items down to 6 or 4. That's just not going to happen. But where people make the mistake sometimes is that they just do that in a vacuum, and then they just say, okay, here's what we're working on, and go do. And then the people that are at the bottom or in the other parts of the organization are like, why are we even doing this? That's a stupid idea. So the idea is to at least start the process with a smaller group and then begin to shop the ideas with the larger group and take some of their input, with the caveat that not every single thing that somebody is going to provide as an idea or a suggestion is going to make the cut. But you have to, if you're going to involve them, you have to have it be greater than 0. Sometimes people will meet and do all these things and the plan looks exactly the same as it did before they met. And that will have a boomerang effect that's pretty negative. So the idea is start small, include then some other folks, make some changes where appropriate, and then you have yourself a decent situation. But I know, Lindsay, from your experience, what's the right amount of people? People ask us all, like, who should be in the room? Who should I invite to this Achieve It kickoff? How have you navigated those conversations?
Yeah, and a lot of it is, to your point, thinking about who are the people who are going to have a say in actually doing the work. So I like to equate it to, a lot of times when I work with this county and people are doing updates and they fill in potholes. And they say the person who is filling the potholes, they are not going to be the person that decides, I'm only going to fill 10 potholes today. They're going to have that idea of, we need to fill 50 potholes, and here's the reason why we need to fill those 50 potholes. So a lot of it comes down to the why and being able to explain that why to people, right? And understanding that I'm doing this because it's helping the overall good. If I had to give an exact number, so let's say in an organization, I had to put a number to it, I would like to keep it between 5 to 10 people and not really having it beyond that, because we get to those points where there's just too many folks in the room and nobody wants to make a decision. So we need to have those top decision makers. So, maybe the CEO or the president, whoever it is, that can give the final say on it. The people that are the heads of those departments who can then communicate that information down. So if I had to put a number, I would say between 5 to 10. But to Joe's point, it depends a lot of times. Depends on the size of the org and depends on the size of the plan too, a lot of times.
Yeah,
Jonathan,
I think
you served as a facilitator. I'm sorry, I'm stepping on you there, but you served as a facilitator many times. How have you seen the dynamic change? Because people can do this on their own, right? They can get the 10 people in a room and then one person might lead it, but then their personalities, maybe like one person has a big personality or an oversized role, and it's hard to do. You as a facilitator, how have you seen that be effective in getting those 10 people to actually walk out with something? Because the risk is you might walk out of the room with nothing because there's too much conversation.
Yeah, I think you definitely have to do kind of bits of each of those. You have to have some level of like phases of planning where there are going to be those 5 to 10 people in the room that are ultimately deciding this is our, as final of a plan as you're going to make it. But there needs to be effective pre-work done before that with the individual teams. If not, you get into those rooms and everybody's starting to think and communicate their ideas for the very first time. I think the most effective teams not only are planning ahead of time, but they're also beginning to communicate those ideas across teams to understand, hey, what are things that we're doing that we can work on together? Or, hey, I think I'm really going to need support for this great idea. What concerns do you have so we can go ahead and talk about it ahead of this official planning meeting? So getting everything prepped ahead will just make it easier for that conversation. And then having an agenda and keeping it on track. I mean, that may be table stakes, but what typically derails those sessions is the conversations that just go on endlessly. And there's always going to be those voices in the room that are going to want to have an opinion on everything. And that's okay as long as it doesn't derail the conversation. I think
to that point, Jonathan, we need a strong facilitator in the room, right? And you might think that can be somebody internal, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen either of you go on site with a customer and they say, oh my gosh, you got this done in a day. It was taking us 6 weeks and we couldn't make any decisions. And it's all because you are a third party, non-biased person in the room. You don't have any, feelings towards one person where you're not going to take their idea or not. And that just helps speed things up. So having that strong facilitator that a lot of times is non-biased, third party, is a huge thing that's going to help folks.
And also, I think one last that has. Oh, sorry, Jonathan.
No, go for
it. The idea that that facilitator that you choose also has no bias coming into it, because a lot of times I've seen facilitators that might come in that are particularly from the Balanced Scorecard Institute or this, that, and the other. And sometimes it's a much bigger conversation around frameworks and how we're going to track things in the future versus actually making a plan. So you have to pick somebody that ideally is there to make sure that after whatever time period, that day or the 2 days, that a plan's created. Everything else is secondary. The other stuff can be taught afterwards. But all those people in a room, that's such a rare thing. And to spend like half your time talking about the virtues of a particular planning methodology can actually have the opposite effect. So be really choosy in who you choose as your facilitator, and really understand what their lens is coming in. And if they are going to be espousing a book they wrote or some other planning methodology, you might want to look elsewhere, because sometimes that could derail.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Let's fast forward a little bit. Let's say we kind of get the right people in the room. We identify what we're going to do, and we're going to finalize that plan. A little bit ambiguous of a question, but how final do you think that plan should be when you actually roll it out? Like, do you make sure everything is 100% buttoned up? Is it, we just need to get 25, 50% of the way there, and we know we're going to have to make adjustments? What have you seen be successful?
The ideas don't need to be fully formulated. You would think at least 80% or better, but the part that has to be 100% done is the responsibility matrix, due dates, cadence of accountability. We call it the 5 elements every plan should have. That's a non-negotiable. The dates, the responsible parties, all the things I just mentioned. The ideas will shift and change based on the year, based on feedback, based on results. That's something that you have to reserve the right to do. Some people get a little scared when I say that. Like, what do you mean we're going to change our plan? Why do we spend 2 days in a room if we're just going to change the plan from time to time? Well, that's just how it goes. I mean, you sitting in a room in January predicting what's going to happen in July. I mean, you hope you're right, but many times you're not going to be right, or maybe you were right for the wrong reasons, or something actually changed the business in a variety of ways. I've heard use cases of big, large microchip companies, because that's a very disrupted market. They meet quarterly as an executive team and look at their plan and make changes to it as a matter of practice, where they're going through the entire plan and saying, does this all make sense? If it does, it's a short meeting. If it doesn't, they spend that time then to revamp and change. So they're committing to that quarterly. Do I expect every one of you listening to do that? That's a lot. But the idea that the plan that you end with looking like the plan you started with, that is not doing yourself any favors if that's actually what you end up doing, because you're telling me that you somehow in January predicted the future for the rest of the year. That's a tough task. And if you have a lot of folks that can see into the future on the call, please send me an email and we'll make some big money on the lottery together and all that great stuff. But just keep in mind, it's not an indictment on you being a bad person by not being able to predict the future. It's the idea of spotting what works earlier and spotting what is not working earlier. So to Jonathan's point, the ideas, 80% need to be shaped up, but the scaffolding around those ideas, 100%.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. Joe and I are working with a customer right now. He's actually going to go do a plan facilitation for them in November. And they were asking, like, what are the levels that we're going to have built out in our plan? Are we going to have everything built out in our plan? And they kind of answer the question for themselves as they're going through this, because they say, okay, we're going to have our 4 priorities. Those aren't changing for the year. Those are set, our 4 priorities. And then we have the goals that are going to support those. But the thing that's going to change, and this could be added in throughout the year, are the strategies that support those goals. And so they ended up answering the question for themselves by actually telling Joe and I, well, those get added in throughout the year. So then they answer the question, we're not going to have the plan fully built out because we don't know what those action plans are going to be that are going to support those goals. Those are going to come up throughout the year as things are changing. So to Joe's point, it's like the structure, the base of it, 100%, but know that it's going to change. I always say success is a moving target. And so we have to make sure that we are continuing to be successful throughout the year.
Yeah, I think for the most part, long gone are the days of 3 to 5 and beyond that year plans. Unless you're having really long-term initiatives, most plans are going to cap out at about a year, because you know that things are going to change pretty dynamically. And I tend to agree. I think 75 to 80% sounds about right, where you have your, maybe those high-level priorities aren't going to change for the year, but you know that those strategies on a quarterly or a couple times a year are going to actually change. And that's why you need to track it throughout and understand that how things are performing through the execution, so that you know when and how to make those modifications.
And to take that point a little bit further, if you're watching the news of the past week, I mean, the 2 biggest EV makers in the country, Tesla being number 1 with way up there, and then Rivian is a kind of an upstart. They have a couple billion in sales. Well, they probably had a plan going into the year. Rivian was doing pretty well with their items, and then all of a sudden, Tesla said, hey, we're going to slash the prices of our models, Model Y and all that, 30% here, 38% there. as you can imagine, that puts a complete dent in all that other competitor company was trying to do. So I'm sure, based on the news today, that Rivian's going back to the drawing board, and they're using that event as something to potentially change the way they're going to look at their strategy. So think about how many times you have a similar event maybe happening in your organization, and you utter the words that are the most dreaded words in planning, which is, let's just see how it goes. If something doesn't feel right, or something looks like it's a seed change in your industry or organization, gather everybody together and at least have a conversation about it. You might choose to not make a change, but you'd be remiss to not have that conversation. And I see a lot of folks sometimes avoid the conversation because they don't want to have to create a new plan, and it's a lot of extra work, but you have to do it. Otherwise, you will be caught flat-footed, which nobody wants.
Yeah, well, kind of keeping an eye on time and making sure we don't keep our listeners too long. We'll have to break this into a couple of different episodes. One thing that I think about obviously plagues planning is kind of all the mistakes that happen that people maybe didn't anticipate. There's a ton of them, but I wanted to get y'all's input on what is one mistake, maybe it's the most common, maybe it's the biggest, that companies regularly make with planning.
I'll say not putting enough time into it, thinking that they're going to be able to get it done so much shorter. And then when it starts taking a really long amount of time, they don't ask for help. So there's been too many instances where somebody said, if I had just had you from day one, we could have gotten this done so much quicker. So notice that and recognize the amount of time it's going to take to do something, and that it's okay and almost better to pull in somebody from the outside to help you with that planning.
I would definitely agree. It takes longer than you'd expect, unless you have the right facilitator. Sometimes it could be shorter, but if doing it left to your own devices, it always takes longer. It's the idea of the planning fallacy that we learned about doing our project management stuff. We always kind of put an optimistic spin on how long things are going to take. How long is it going to take me to run errands this Saturday? Oh, an hour. But you have to go to 5 places. They're all across town. There's no way it's going to take an hour. But that's usually how our brains go. So the idea of not being conservative with how long things are going to take. But one problem that I do see, though, is I just spend a lot of time helping our clients wordsmith what things they're working on in their plan, where they'll put something in the plan that's very vague. It'll say like a reporting tool. You're like, well, what about it? Are you creating one? Are you finding one? Are you rolling it out? Are you training people on it? So making sure that there's a verb in the name of the thing you're working on. It seems very elementary, but I promise you that verb is missing 80, 90% of the time. Super vague. And if I'm looking at the plan and I'm not in the department that it's impacted, I would have no clue about what they're working on. So the litmus test I tell people is, if somebody from a different department were to come in and review your initiatives, would they at least be in the general ballpark of what you're working on based on what you wrote out? If the answer is no, spend a little time wordsmithing it. And it doesn't need to be a paragraph. We're talking about a sentence, but a really well-defined sentence that explicitly calls out what you're doing. No need to be brief on that. Because if the goal is to get everybody organized on what we're working on, you can't have half the people not even understanding what that other half is working on. So just keep in mind that is time well spent. And honestly, quite a large amount of the time that I spend with clients helping them build their plan is helping them wordsmith the various items.
I'll say even people in the same department will say, I don't know what that means. So you could even ask somebody in your same department, do you understand this? And if they say no, then you need to wordsmith it, to Joe's point.
Yeah. I'm going to cheat and do 2, but I asked the question so I can do that. I think the first one, since I'm a numbers and metrics guy, is going back to having that right balance between leading and lagging indicators. The easiest example that always comes up from a personal standpoint is you wouldn't go into your New Year's resolution to be a healthier person and have no way to measure that. And you wouldn't say that you're going to measure that success by how many calories you've eaten or just how many times you're going to exercise. You're going to have some higher goal and then the activity that combines to actually measure that progress. Are you doing the activities and are you getting the results? That's something that people often miss in their planning, and having that balance really can help them not only drive the outcomes, but progress throughout the way. And then second, I think, comes down to communication. We talked a lot about planning, but I think people put so much emphasis on communication during planning, and then they say, here's our plan, and it stops. So people are going to lose that excitement if you don't continually talk about it afterwards and help them understand how things are progressing. The things that you said were so important, the things that they said were so important, they don't just vanish into thin air. All right, well, we'll wrap it up here with the last question. We typically ask all of our guests the same last question, so we will do a very similar question where instead of advice on our own career, if you had to go back, based on everything you've learned, Lindsay and Joe, in your careers, and you were kicking off a planning process that started today, what is one piece of advice that you would give yourself?
I'd say ask questions and make sure that you have clarification on things. Don't just go with it. I know so many people, they said, oh, we used an outside facilitator before and they said it was fine. And now I'm asking them a question and they're realizing that it's not fine what they have set up in place. So don't be afraid to ask those questions and make sure that there is clarity.
And for me, I think a book that really spoke to me a while back is the book called Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a World of Specialists. It's the idea of if you are going to be a true good strategic planner that's going to make the best plan, you have to have a situational awareness of pretty much every department and what they do. Do you need to be an expert in every single area? No. But if you're the person that's trying to have a conversation with all these different disciplines and you don't really have a good understanding of how engineering works or your product or whatever it may be, it limits you. So taking the time, to Lindsay's point, to ask questions, but really embed yourself in your different aspects of your organization and truly say, I'm here to learn and listen and do it. And it's not a one-time event, right? You might spend a day or two with the department and then maybe every quarter spend some time with them to truly know what they're doing. It helps build trust with the people that you're working with, and it helps you be a better facilitator if you're choosing to do it internally because you're speaking the same language as everybody in the room and you're really appealing to them. If you do that, I've seen that be a very effective in starting a planning cycle because when you speak, people will listen.
Yeah, and I think we all have similar but different. The one what I would add is to go into a planning process kind of being open to things different. I think it's important to plan ahead of time, but if you go in with this agenda as like, hey, these are the 10 things that we have to do, all that's going to come from that is long discussions, confrontations, as opposed to really being open to, as Lindsay mentioned, asking those questions, but also being open to the answers and how that may impact this idea of the future that you think is correct. So making sure that you're flexible, not just after the plan is created, but flexible during that plan's creation to kind of have a cohesive planning process.
Love it.
Perfect. Well, we will have to do many more of these in the future because I know we could have gone on probably for a few hours talking about topics like this. So both Joe and Lindsay, I very much appreciate your time and looking forward to chatting again soon.